Good morning, Bradford Church family. Once again, we are not meeting in light of the trends that we've had with regard to COVID. And so we hope that we are going to be able to resume meeting here very soon, but we're not ready to make an announcement today. But we're thankful that you've joined us for a time of sharing in God's Word this week. And to any guests that we have joining us as well, we welcome you and look forward to the opportunity we may have to see you in person at our services at Bradford Church. Today we're going to begin a new series of messages called Once Upon a Time in Bethlehem. This is the Christmas series that I try to do every year. And over the next 4 Sundays, we're going to follow the events of Christmas and the Christmas story as it unfolds, from the early prophecies to the holy night when Christ was born. And I do hope that you enjoy this story over the next few weeks together. Once upon a time in Bethlehem, more than 2,000 years ago, the world was in disarray. Though it was in the era of Pax Romana, which means it was a time of peace throughout the Roman Empire, this peace had come at a tremendous price, and the government was a very heavy-handed government, and it was a very oppressive government. In Israel, God's people were under the rule of a maniacal, abusive leader who had been working systematically for years to limit the freedom of the people and to exploit their labor. And throughout all of Israel, the expectation of a coming Messiah, God's chosen one to lead Israel into a new age of peace and prosperity, it really was at its peak in terms of expectation. And so that's where our story takes place. But it's not where the story begins. We know that the story actually began centuries before in the Garden of Eden. And you've heard this, I know. God created a paradise for Adam and Eve to enjoy. And then the tempter entered into the picture, a duplicitous serpent, and he deceived them. He fast-talked them into eating the fruit in the garden, the one that they were not allowed to eat, the only one. And thus began the fall of humankind. From there, it was a short journey before the world became filled with hatred, violence, greed, and corruption. The world was just like the world that we live in today, just like the world that we see today. Our current troubles that we are experiencing really are nothing new. It's been this way throughout all of history. In his anger, God spoke to the serpent and said, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all the wild animals, and you will basically crawl on your belly and you will eat dust for all the days of your life." And then it tells us in Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Now these words were a prophecy, a promise from God that someday one would come into the world to undo the damage that the serpent had done, that he had set in motion. He had skewered history by his actions, but before it's all over, we know that God would make it right. And the final phrase of this prophecy, "He will crush your head and you will strike his heel," is a poetic way of saying that Satan, you may hurt him a little bit, but he will ultimately take you out. In other words, Mr. Serpent, your demise is imminent. And throughout Israel's history, they continued to talk about the Messiah and prophecy about him and look forward to the time of his coming. The Old Testament contains hundreds of such prophecies that, and this is a spoiler alert for you, they were ultimately fulfilled by Jesus. Some of the prophecies of Christ were very specific ones, and some were more general in nature, but all of them offered us hope, such that is spoken by the prophet Jeremiah as an example. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up to David a righteous branch, a king who will do wisely and do what is just and right in the land." That comes from Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5. And then the prophet Isaiah says, "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice." And that comes from chapter 42, verse 3. Throughout history, God's people speculated often about these prophecies found in the Old Testament scriptures and how they might be fulfilled. And they didn't always get it right, but what they didn't get wrong was that someday God would send a Messiah to establish his kingdom forever. It was not merely the Jews that held on to this idea, believe it or not. Ancient historians tell us that in this age there was a crescendo of expectation all throughout the secular world as well. An expectation that a great ruler would rise up and establish this universal kingdom. And it was believed that this king, according to the writings of Suetonius and Tacitus and Josephus, would come from an out-of-the-way, dirt-poor, often overlooked province in the great Roman Empire, that being Judea. And Judea, just like the Jews had long believed. It was around this time, in a world more than 1,000 miles away, a group of magi were busy going about their lives. The Magi were a fraternity of scholars whose responsibilities included fulfilling the role of spiritual advisor to the kings of Persia. And they were a unique blend of philosopher, mystic, scientist, and priest. And among their academic pursuits was the study of the movement of the stars and planets. And they were astronomers more than they were astrologers. But they did believe that there was a prophetic message that could be found in the interpretation of celestial events. And so it happened several years BC that they observed an alignment of the planets that indicated to them the coming of a king. Not just that a man would suddenly come to power, but that a child would be born, and a child who was destined to become the greatest ruler that the world had ever known. And where would this magnificent birth take place? The position of the largest star indicated that it was this dusty desert region of Judea. Judea, just like the Jews had long believed. And this was not a passing fancy for them. These priests sincerely believed what the heavens seemed to be saying. So they did the only thing that they knew to do. They packed up a caravan and they began their westward journey toward the city of Jerusalem. And from there, they would determine exactly where it was that the star was leading them. Now in Jerusalem, there lived a man by the name of Simeon. And he was a righteous and devout man, faithful in service. He was filled with the Holy Spirit. And for his entire life, he prayed for the coming of the Messiah. And so God told him that he would not die before he had seen the chosen one face to face. So Simeon lived with great expectation. Year after year, this expectation only increased. Will it be this year? Will today be the day that I will meet the one who is to be called the Christ? And Simeon knew that the Messiah was coming. It wasn't a matter of if, it was basically a matter of when. And he knew that it was soon because he was not a young man any longer. I want you to remember Simeon's name because we're going to meet him again a little later on in this series of messages. Now, also in Jerusalem lived another man who would take a very special interest in this child. But the interest that he took was of a sinister nature because he saw in this infant king as a threat to his power. And of course, the man I'm talking about is a man who made his mark on history, Herod the Great, king of Judea. Herod claimed to be Jewish. He followed some of the customs. He refused to eat pork, for example, but he was ruthless with his Jewish people. And he ruled the land with an iron fist, and he was, by all accounts, a bloodthirsty tyrant. And he dealt with his enemies and his perceived enemies with swiftness and with great force. For example, he once killed 300 officers in his army simply because he did not believe in their allegiance to him. He was also someone who was a very lavish spender and a prolific builder. In a mere 18 months, he rebuilt the main structure of the temple there in Jerusalem, and then he named it after himself. And today, sections of the Temple Mount, including the section known as the Wailing Wall, are still standing. Most noteworthy, though, about Herod is that he was deeply, and you could even say pathologically, insecure. He considered everyone a threat to his ruling of Israel. And so when he heard that a new king was to be born in this remote region, he was ready to respond as he had responded before to these types of things. And I told you, of course, how he dealt with the officers in his armies. In another instance, just a few years earlier, Herod had feared that his wife, Miriam, was plotting to kill him. And so he had her arrested and put through a mockery of a trial and then put to death. And her brother and her mother also met the same fate. At another point, he suspected that his eldest son was conspiring against him, so he had his son executed. And sometime after that, he became suspicious of his two younger sons, so he had them beheaded as well. And at this point, it was that Caesar Augustus said, since Herod was known to keep a kosher diet, it was said of him that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son. Now, speaking of Caesar Augustus, he was the ruler of the Roman Empire. He was Herod's boss, you might say. And he decided around this time that a census would be taken throughout the Roman world. And his reason for this census was simple. You cannot tax your citizens and compel young men to military service if you don't know where they are and who they are. And so everyone was to return to their ancestral city where their family is from and register their residency and their personal details. And for most citizens, this probably wasn't much of a journey because most people tended to live their entire lives in the same area, the same region. But for the main characters in the Christmas story, it did involve a long journey. And as it turns out, this arbitrary and ambitious urge to tax the whole world played a vital role in bringing God's plan together. One of the ancient prophecies said that the Messiah would be born in a little town called Bethlehem, which is about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. In fact, Micah chapter 5, verse 2 says this, "But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will come forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His times of coming forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity." Now, Bethlehem was this quiet little community, hardly affluent, probably didn't have a population of 1,000 people. It was not the kind of city where you would expect that a king would be born. However, we do know that one great king had already been born there. Of course, I'm talking about King David. And he was the one who defeated Goliath. He later ruled Israel. He wrote most of the Psalms. This King David was born in Bethlehem. And according to the prophets, the King of all kings would be born in this same tiny village as well. Who then did God choose to be the parents to bring this child into the world? Did he choose the patriarch of a local synagogue in Bethlehem? Did he choose a high-profile member of the community with a pedigree of leadership? No, he didn't do that at all. What he did do was choose a couple from poor working-class families in a small town of Nazareth in the region of Galilee, which was about 80 miles to the north. And I said there was nothing really flashy about Bethlehem, and this is true to even a greater extent about Galilee. Though Bethlehem was a small town, it was quite near to Jerusalem, as I said before, and that, of course, was a thriving metropolis, the great city of God. And Bethlehem did have a claim to fame because it was the city of David. It was the birthplace of King David. But Nazareth, on the other hand, was in a location that was far more remote, mostly rural, and predominantly poor. It was not an area identified with greatness in any way. It was not known as a center of education or commerce or the arts. The people there lived hard, simple lives. Maybe today you could compare it to the poorest parts of Appalachia. In fact, many years later, a man named Philip said to his friend Nathanael, according to John chapter 1, verse 46, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked. And he was, of course, making a joke at the expense of the region. And so when I was growing up here in Ohio, we might say West Virginia. Can anything good come from West Virginia? It was not a region much respected among men, but this is something we will learn in the course of this series. God is not an elitist at all. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. You can be a part of God's plan. So it was in Nazareth of Galilee where God called a young couple to be the central figures in this Christmas story. First, there was Joseph. And though he wasn't to play the role of a traditional father, he was asked to play a role far more essential and far more challenging. Joseph was a carpenter. The Greek word that describes his profession can also be translated as stonemason. I just recently learned this. I had just assumed that Joseph was a carpenter, but in fact, he was likely a construction worker who could do stonemasonry as well. He worked with his hands and, of course, again, mainly in construction. We're not sure how old he was, but he was old enough to take on the responsibility of a family. He would have been an ideal choice as a good husband. He had a marketable skill. He had a good reputation. And as we will see in the weeks to come, he was a man of great character and great courage. In keeping with the customs of the day, at some point, Joseph or his parents approached the father of a young woman and asked her permission to marry her. And we can only guess how well they may have knew each other before that. Perhaps they had been friends, or perhaps they only recognized each other in passing. But Joseph, I'm sure, saw something special in this young woman, and he could imagine being able to build a life with her, and he wanted her to be his bride. The young woman, well, her name was Mary. We don't really know how old she was, but she was almost certainly a teenager because that was the age in which most women got married. And so it was decided that she would marry Joseph. It may appear that she didn't have much say in the matter, but the fact is that even in those days, the choice was not merely a take it or leave it as it sounds. It was expected most of the time that a couple planning to be married would reach a consensus together and would want to do that. This consensus was most often reached during the initial stage of the relationship called the courtship or the engagement. This was usually done by an agreement between the parents or with the help of a matchmaker. And during this courtship stage, either one could back out of the decision if they so chose. Now, after that period came what we know as the betrothal. The betrothal lasted for 1 year. And during this phase, the couple were considered man and wife. And they were man and wife in every way except one. They were not yet intimate. And betrothal was a legally binding arrangement, and the only way to get out of it was through the process of divorce. And of course, after the betrothal came the marriage. The marriage was made official with a community-wide celebration ceremony, and that was followed by a honeymoon. And so Joseph and Mary were betrothed, and they were legally man and wife, committed to one another for life, but they were not living in the same house or sleeping in the same bed. Their future, they thought, though, was certain. They believed that it was mapped out for years to come. But then one afternoon, Mary was spending some time alone. Perhaps she was sitting under a tree near a quiet stream saying her prayers. But then she realized that she was not alone. An angel appears before her and gives her this message that's just too incredible to believe, a message that would change everything about the world as we know it. This is where our story will pick up next week. In these final moments of this message today, there's a couple ideas that I really would like for you to consider. Things about this story that are relevant to your life today. First of all, I want you to know that God is at work behind the scenes to make the details of your life come together, just the way that they're supposed to. We often see only random events and occurrences that appear to be beyond our control, but God is at work bringing the details together. Even something as seemingly random as a self-serving emperor 3,000 miles away deciding to take this national census so that an increase in taxes could happen throughout the world. It might have seemed like it was his decision, but God was at work behind the scenes. King Solomon said in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, "In his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord directs his steps." And if you want him to, if you are surrendered to God's will, God can make these so-called random events conform to his eternal plan. Now, secondly, I want you to know that the outcome of his work will certainly be good. Let me just say that again. The outcome of God's work will certainly be good. In fact, we're told in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and are called and who have been called according to his purpose. And so God can take any event, no matter how ugly or unplanned, and turn it into something beautiful, something that is good for all of eternity. Like another man named Joseph. This one in the book of Genesis, whose brothers sold him into slavery for a few dollars. And then years later, Joseph was the one who saved his family from famine. And not only his family, but all of Egypt from famine. And he said in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Now, thirdly and finally, for this reason, you can face the future with patient expectation. Now, we don't always know what God is doing or why, and we're not always sure how things are going to work out. We can only be sure that things will work out. As the psalmist said in Psalm 138, verse 8, "The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me." And so I want you to know that he will fulfill his purpose for you. And if you are ready to let him take the lead in your life, that can happen. God is up to something, and he's been up to something throughout all of history, from the opening pages of Genesis to the events within your life this very day. He is bringing everything together for his glory and for your good. And so this is why, in this first Sunday of the Christmas season, the key word is hope, because we have every reason to live in hope. Why? Because God is up to something. God is up to something good, and God will make it happen. Amen? That's my message today. And I hope something I've said has been challenging to you or maybe convicting to you. And if you realize today, after listening to this message, that it's important for you to make a decision regarding your relationship with Jesus Christ, I want you to know we stand ready to assist you with that. However that may be, is it turning your life over to him, giving your life to Jesus? Is it rededicating yourself to the Lord? Is it finding a church home? Any of these things we can assist you with today. I'm going to give you my phone number, 740-645-3243. If you have any of the needs that I just mentioned or some other needs like prayer that you need, just give me a call and we will make sure that we take care of that. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.